الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآله وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Last night I briefly introduced the topic that I want to cover for these 10 days that I'm here with you. Let me briefly introduce it again, and I'll jump into today's segment of that topic. I mentioned that we have certain paradigms, certain models, certain kind of notions about how the world works. And these paradigms, we work according to these paradigms all the time, right? We have certain assumptions that we make, certain things that we know about how things work based on Islamic sources, and other people also have these sorts of paradigms. There are certain paradigms upon which our kind of the larger society in which we live in is based. Non-Islamic society is based. And because we live here, because we live in the society, when we're in constant interaction with that society, those paradigms also have a large effect on us, especially if we're not aware of what they are, and especially if we take them at face value and run with them. I mentioned that example yesterday of the paradigm that many Christians have, literalist Christians, creationists, have this idea that the earth is young, a young earth theory that's 6,000 years old. And once they have that paradigm, that assumption, and they start to build their beliefs on that one assumption, they very quickly run into a problem. Right? It worked for a long time until geology was born as a science back in the even before the Renaissance, back in the 14th, 15th century. People started to realize that things didn't work out quite as the Bible portrayed it, and that view of that particular paradigm being with the Earth 6,000 years old, that didn't pan out, and that led to so many different controversies within the church, and eventually a major split between people who were scientific-minded and looking at empirical evidence versus those who believed in the Bible. Right? So that paradigm, having that false paradigm of kind of assuming that the earth is a particular age and placing Noah's flood at 5,000 years ago, right? And then having that disproven by empirical science, gave fodder for scientists on one hand to reject religion because they said, well, most of the world is Christian and the Catholic Church is this and that, and they're the ones who propound this idea about Noah's flood. That's obviously false, so the whole story must be a myth. The whole thing must be false, the whole Bible must be false, and it's led to this huge rift where they rejected God and religion altogether. That's the danger. That's one of the extreme cases of a false paradigm having such devastating effects on people. All right, so one of the paradigms that I want to focus on, that's going to be the topic for today, is something that you might chuckle at first because it seems kind of maybe it might seem kind of a silly theme. But if you think about it, you realize that we are constantly bombarded by this particular paradigm. And the paradigm is this: that love is something that you just fall into, that just happens to you. Right? People fall in love. And it's a thing that kind of automatically happens. It's people look at each other and there's a twinkle in their eye, and somehow things happen, and all of a sudden they're in love, right? It's kind of, it seems like maybe a silly sort of a thing to talk about. I want to show you that particular theme, first of all, is extremely prevalent. And if you just stop and think about I don't know, the latest movies that you've watched, the latest TV programs that you've watched, the latest books and novels that you've read. All of them, every single love story that we have in front of us, which is constant. Every story just about has a love story. It's usually one of the common themes that's there in Hollywood movies, in Disney movies, in storybooks, and all sorts of things. Almost every one of these is based on this particular paradigm. And I want to show you that this paradigm is dangerous. Having this particular view of how love works, it has devastating consequences for many parts of our life, especially as Muslims. Is this an appropriate topic for a majlis? Yes, it is. for several reasons. This is a little bit of a disclaimer, but just to prevent you from thinking that, oh, this is a majlis of Imam Hussein, we should be talking about Imam Hussein and Karbala and those specific stories and those specific themes. This is extremely important as well. I mentioned yesterday that one of the benefits of these particular majalis is that it's become really the only way for continuous, ongoing education to occur in our community. We have really no other way. We have Sunday schools and madrasas, these kinds of things for younger people. And that has, it has some benefit for them, getting them to a certain level. Parents' influence is much more important as a guiding factor for those children. But once you get past a certain age, unless you yourself take the reins of your own Islamic education, there's very little that can happen on a communal level besides these majalis that we have, these lectures that we have. This is one of the reasons why we as Shia are much better off than other communities, because we have this institution of majalis, right? So that's a blessing that we should accept and appreciate, but at the same time we should squeeze it for all it's worth and make sure that we make these into places where we can think about important topics that are influential in our lives. In a way, you can think of this talk as kind of an inoculation. Right, when we immunize ourselves against disease, we expose ourselves in a limited fashion, in a controlled fashion to that disease so that our body can build up resistance to the real thing when it finally hits us. A smart thing to do is not to put ourselves in a bubble. If we want to immunize ourselves against those diseases, we don't simply shelter ourselves and say, let me not be exposed to it at all, because of course then our body has no resistance at all. When we're finally exposed to it, it can wreak havoc. The same thing happens here. Right? This topic might be something that you might think, well, is it appropriate for our kids to hear? Absolutely. Is it appropriate for us to hear? Appropriate for all of us? Let's expose ourselves to it in this sort of setting. Let me, as somebody who's studied, as somebody who's thought about this right? Let me expose you to it in a limited fashion, a controlled fashion, with all the safeguards in place, so that you're then immunized. Then when you go out and you're exposed to the real thing, you're that much stronger, and you can deal with the real danger in a way where you've already been kind of built up those defenses against it. If you think that your children have not already been exposed to it, think again. Right? Disney movies, right? We think they have a G rating on them, and we think, oh, that makes it great for them. That's not necessarily the case. And I'm not saying we don't watch them or you don't let your kids watch them. That's not the case. That's not my conclusion for any of today's talks. That don't expose yourself, don't go out there, don't watch movies, don't read books. That's not the final conclusion. The conclusion is be aware of the paradigm, be critical of it, and then realize that that's not the way things really work. And know how things really work, so you're constantly editing out and censoring out those things, and you're able to put into context all of these things that we're being exposed to. And that's something that parents will have to work with their kids to do, because it's a complex thing, a complex kind of process for children to work on. Recite with salawat, please. All right, so back to this paradigm. The paradigm is that love is something that just happens to us. We are passively involved, and somehow it just occurs. We fall into love. That expression itself kind of shows that it's a very telling expression, that we fall into love. Right? You fall into a puddle, right? You fall into you fall into other sorts of things like that, and then we also use the same phrase that we fall into love. Just accidentally, just happens, right? Love is portrayed as a physical attraction. Right? And love is portrayed as this emotional attachment to somebody. But again, it's something that just happens. It's uncontrollable. Right? It's something that once it happens, once the gears start moving, then the consequences are inevitable. You can't control it. You can't resist it. It just happens to you. It's portrayed as something that is inevitable. Right? It's also portrayed, once it occurs, once you fall into this substance called love, right? It's also portrayed as something that we should pursue, no matter what obstacles come in the way. Whatever social taboos there might be working against you, whatever ethical, religious taboos there might be that are working against you, whatever familial resistance you might find, right? The theme is this paradigm presents love as something that is such a noble thing to pursue that you should disregard all these things, overcome all these obstacles, and pursue it anyway, right? And it's also one final element of this. So we have kind of the life cycle of this is that there's certain things that go into falling in love. That's part of the paradigm. There's certain things about once love happens, how you should pursue it. And then the third part of it is when you are in love, it's kind of it's its own beast. It has its own life cycle. And once it fades, once it goes, then that's it. It's uncontrollable as well. So it comes without control. And then it also sometimes leaves without control, and you have nothing to say in the meantime. And you're simply a kind of I don't know, something being pushed around by waves, pushed around by the wind this way and that, by this thing that overcomes us, which is called love. And that's the paradigm, and it's kind of theoretical. But think of any story that you can call to mind. Think of some of the Disney love stories. Think of, I don't know, Romeo and Juliet. Think of, probably the last movie, the last TV show, the last novel. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So why is it so important to talk about this? What is the problem with having this kind of a paradigm of love? And why is it so dangerous that it's worthy of speaking about it in this kind of a setting? Having this kind of a paradigm leads to, in many ways, an undermining of the foundation of marriage itself, which in turn is the foundation of our community. Right? The family, in the Islamic worldview, is the building block of society, not the individual, the family. Right? A healthy family and a community of healthy families is a healthy community. And so much of the Sharia is there to help us to foster that healthy community, because that healthy community makes the man and the wife, the husband and the wife healthy, and they're happy, and their needs are fulfilled, their life is healthy and sound, and then they can become the cornerstones upon which those children can be nurtured, right? And those strong children who are educated correctly and just emotionally healthy and all that, they become the foundation for that society, right? So marriage is extremely important. This kind of a paradigm, because it's dealing with love and it's undermining those underpinnings of love, it ends up undermining marriage itself. If you think about it, one of the detriments of this kind of a worldview is that it justifies certain unlawful marital relations. If love is something that I fall into, that's inevitable, that just happens to me, I just see someone and it just happens, then what's to stop me from falling in love at any point in my life with any particular person, without any sort of control? It can happen before marriage. You have premarital relations because of this. You can have extramarital relations during your marriage because of this. And then you can also have completely skewed relations, homosexual and these kinds of relations as well because of this, because love just happens. Whoever you're attracted to, that's good, that's right, that's justified. Right? And so that foundation of marriage, where marriage is supposed to be the place where love is nurtured, where love flourishes, that's no longer important, because love can flourish in just about any environment, in any context. Before marriage, during marriage, with other people, and then even outside of that, outside of the opposite sex with same-sex marriages and these kinds of things. So that's one extremely pernicious aspect of this paradigm. Another problem for us as Muslims is that it messes with our own conception of what marriage is. Right? If we have this paradigm of love in this particular way, that it's something that just happens, then our view of marriage itself becomes very, very skewed. Right? I'll start to, for instance, maybe you've had the same experience yourself with other people who are getting married around you in the community or whatever else. Oftentimes, people who are looking for marriage, they end up, for instance, falling in love with somebody because of relationships either through university or through work-related types of things, or other kinds of relationships that we might have. We interact with people constantly, and if this is your kind of view of how things work, then you say, well, I'm attracted to this person, and I'm now in love with this person, and now, no matter what, I want to get married to that person. Right? And it ends up that we start to prioritize love and attraction over all those other practical things that are extremely important for a successful marriage. So oftentimes I've seen people who are in love and they get married because of that, despite the fact that everything else is going against them. Right? Religion, being on the same page religiously is extremely important. But love is blind to that. Right? These people have fallen in love based on other kinds of attraction, and they've ignored the fact that they're not even on the same page religiously. One person might be more practicing as a Muslim, and one person might be less practicing, or they might be actually following two different religions. But because they're in love, they start to justify it and say, well, it can work, and hopefully he'll see the light, hopefully she'll see the light, and I'll be able to guide him or her. And they think that somehow things will work themselves out, when it's a pipe dream. Right? Things don't work themselves out at that fundamental level. Religion is the backbone of who we are. It doesn't just work itself out. Right? So that's one thing. Other practical considerations, like lifestyle considerations, right? Instead of because they are in love, they're blinded to the fact that my prospective wife's lifestyle is completely different from mine. She expects, for instance, she expects that she wants to have a career, and that's not what I expect from her. Or she expects not to have a career, and I do expect a career from her. Right? You're just not on the same page in those major things. And a career for many people is a huge chunk of their life. Their dreams throughout high school and college, if they've been raised a certain way, they're going to be thinking that this is a particular path I want to take, and a huge part of who they are is by the career. It's defined by the career that they have chosen, man or woman. How is that going to be somehow work itself out? Simply because you've fallen in love. Family dynamics are also important. Right? People come from certain families. Maybe it's been a very traditional type of a family with a strong father and a mother who's nurturing and these kinds of things. But then the other spouse might be from a family that wasn't like that. Maybe it was a single parent household. Maybe it was a strong mother and the father was more passive. Or so many different dynamics. But those ideals that were implanted in us as children are going to have an effect on what our expectations are of marriage, for our own marriage and our own relationship. And if those are not in sync, or at least there's not some understanding and some idea about how that's going to work itself out, it's not going to just work itself out simply because you're in love. Right? So there's so many of these aspects, so many of these practical considerations that we then become blind to because we think that love, what makes a marriage work is love, without realizing that what actually makes a marriage work is those practical considerations. Love is actually, well, we'll talk about what love is, but just as a spoiler, the love is something that can be nurtured, it can be fostered, it can be created and made because everything else is in place. And it doesn't work the other way. Love doesn't fix everything else, but everything else with enough work can make love happen. Finally, it also justifies ending that marriage. Right? If I have that view that love happens and then it fades and it's automatic, the life cycle of love is out of my control, I'm no longer in love with my spouse, then I'll basically say, well, now it's time to move on. This marriage is gone, and I need to move on and find another spouse, without realizing that no, I can actually there's stuff I can still do to make this work. Right? So all around, at every stage of our relationship, then this paradigm has extremely detrimental effects if we take it passively, if we live our lives by it, and if we kind of model our marriages on this kind of a view of how love works. That's why it's so important to talk about this. Recite with salawat, please. One more, please. Now, what's the Islamic alternative to this? So what's the Islamic paradigm for how love works? Right? Because we have to have some sort of a solution, some sort of an alternate paradigm, because this is definitely an important part of our lives. Partly, the Islamic paradigm is similar, right? In terms of love, at least love in terms of attraction, love in terms of emotional attachment. Those aspects of love, it's a human reality. It doesn't change by Islam telling you one thing or the other. Right? There's some things that are just the way things work. Right? When I'm hungry, I need to eat. It doesn't matter if someone tells me that you don't have to eat or you do have to eat, or whatever you tell me, I'm still hungry. I still have to satisfy that urge. Right? And love is the same way. Physical attraction does happen passively, automatically, whether or not I want it to happen. right? So that part of the equation is common to, between Islam and between this Western paradigm. But where it differs is that we understand Islamically that I'm not helpless with regards to the things that lead into love. Right? Physical attraction. Once the man sees the woman, once the woman sees the man, and they have that interaction, then things happen automatically. The attraction is there. The love is whatever superficial love is there. However, we have a role to play in preventing that from ever actually happening, at least not out of our control. Right? And if you think about a lot of the Islamic guidelines that we have for male-female interaction, interaction with non-mahrams, they feed into this and they prevent this kind of uncontrolled attraction from ever taking place. Right? So just think about the senses, the way we can interact with the opposite gender in terms of looking. Right? We have so many different restrictions to try to control that particular faculty of ours, so that, for instance, men are required to lower their gaze whenever they feel any sort of temptation from looking at a non-mahram woman. Even a mahram woman, even a mahram woman, if you have that temptation, then even then you have to. It's the man's duty to look down, to look away, to control his gaze and not look at her. Right, so that's there to nip that attraction in the bud, to prevent it from ever happening. On the women's side, then their dress is also important, how they dress and that they wear hijab and it's loose-fitting and comfortable and these kinds of things, so that it prevents that engagement of the sight of the man from ever occurring. If you think about the rulings for mixed gatherings, right, we have prohibitions against mixed gatherings where those mixed gatherings are inappropriate. Right, if it's a mixed gathering where everyone's dressed appropriately, everyone's acting appropriately, that kind of thing, that's one thing. That's permissible. But weddings, for instance, typically, a wedding is a time kind of internationally, we're Muslim or non-Muslim, it's a time when everyone wants to dress up. Women want to dress up especially. And because of that, because women inevitably do dress up, and it's their expectation, it's society's expectation that they would dress up, it becomes problematic if it's a mixed gathering there. Right? So we're not allowed to have those kinds of a mixed gathering of a wedding where women are dressed up and then there's mingling between the genders. That, by the way, is extremely problematic. Right? I don't know how that plays out in your community, but some communities have a very hard time. I have such a hard time. I've actually made a policy that I won't attend a wedding unless I'm kind of assured ahead of time that it's going to be appropriate. At least I'm not going to wear this uniform in and officiate the wedding and these kinds of things if the wedding is kind of based on a very haram kind of interaction. So anyway, these kinds of restrictions that we have in Islamic law, that's just a sampling of them. They're there and they're in place to prevent one of those causes of attraction from ever happening, so that the turn of love never comes because they haven't ever looked at each other, they haven't ever seen each other in that sort of a way, in a way that's going to provoke attraction. Even in terms of listening and hearing. Right, we have laws, sometimes these might not be as well known, but in terms of listening to the opposite gender, to non-mahrams, we have restrictions on both on what a woman can, for instance, recite or sing. If her voice is she has such a voice, or she kind of makes her voice attractive to men, then it's haram for her to do that, to make her voice audible to men. It's haram for men to listen to her if there's that fear of falling into sin. Right? So there's certain restrictions then on even hearing. We have to control that because that's one of the ways that love and attraction eventually happens. Whoever has the switch for the fan, could you turn it back on, please? Yeah. Thanks. Even smelling. The sense of smell is one of the ways that we are attracted. And even there, Islam has come up with a rule to restrict us against, for instance, smelling the opposite gender. What I mean by perfume and things like that. So a woman can't wear perfume in a public gathering which is going to be near non-mahram men, at least with two conditions. One is that her intention, if her intention is to attract, then it's haram for her to do it. Or if even there's that possibility and that danger of men being attracted to her, even if her intention is not bad, but maybe the men in the gathering are not upright or whatever, then it's also haram for her to wear that perfume and ether and that kind of a thing. In terms of touching, we also have restrictions, right? So non-mahram interactions in terms of shaking hands, even to the extent of shaking hands is prohibited, much less hugging and kissing on the cheek and these kinds of things, which is commonplace, right? In social circles here, in non-Muslim social circles, it's very commonplace for friends to hug, even if they're from the opposite gender. But Islam goes to the extent of even prohibiting shaking hands, which seems like a very benign thing, but it's a slippery slope. Once that happens, then the rest of it is very easy to happen as well. Even to the extent, I don't remember a fatwa in any modern books, but I know in Lum'a and some of the older books they had this issue that. So I'll put it like this: at least some of our scholars, at least some of our scholars have passed the fatwa that even, for instance, imagine if a woman is sitting in a seat, and then she gets up from the seat and the seat's still warm. They said it's haram for her to sit in that seat where it's still, the warmth of her body is still there. Right? To that extent, like we want to kind of maintain the separation between the genders to that extent, so that there's not even that much of a fuel for our imagination to think anything inappropriate about that person. Right? So the point then is that these are a sampling of some of the rules that we have where Islam has tried to prevent that process, which is an automatic process of attraction. It's tried to prevent that process from ever taking place, from ever happening, unless we ourselves want it to happen. So when it comes time for marriage, there the restrictions are lessened. Right? So for instance, we have the permission then to interact relatively freely between the prospective bride and groom, that they can interact with each other, speak relatively freely, at least within certain contexts, to get to know each other a little bit better. To the extent, and this is kind of an uncomfortable ruling that, especially in our times, it seems very odd, but we have it's on the books and it's part of the Sunnah. We have the permission for the man to actually see the woman before marriage, to see her without her hijab on. Only after everything else is settled. They've already talked about all the practical issues. Everything else is going to work out. Everything seems perfect. The only issue left is the physical attraction. And that is an important thing. Islam accounts for that. It encourages us to, or it acknowledges the fact that we need that. We need that aspect to our relationships as well. So it allows even that in the courtship process as a last kind of step before the actual agreement is made, that the man is allowed to see the woman without hijab on. And it's on the books, it's allowed. Whether it's comfortable for us to practice in our context and stuff like that, that's a different question. But my point is that the restrictions are there to an extent, but when it comes time to marriage and we're ready to engage in that and kind of allow the attraction to occur, the love to occur, that's when the restrictions are released and the interaction is allowed. And then of course once marriage happens, then there's no restriction anymore. Right? I remember Shaykh Mutahiri in one of his books, I think it's The Woman and Her Rights, he mentions this idea that, or maybe it's Islamic modest dress, but he mentions the idea that for non-Muslims who have that kind of false paradigm of love, for them marriage is a prison. Because outside of the context of marriage, they're free to do whatever they want and have all sorts of relationships. But all of a sudden, when marriage happens and it's all of a sudden a monogamous relationship, that becomes restrictive on them, and it's a prison for them. Whereas for a Muslim, it's just the opposite. We're in prison before marriage, and then when we finally get married, then we're freed. Then all of a sudden, marriage becomes the goal, the destination, where we're happy and everything happens. Before marriage, outside of the context of marriage, you're shackled, and you feel restricted. Right? And that's the way it should be. That's the paradigm that Islam wants. That marriage, because marriage is so important, everything leads us towards that, to make sure that marriage is strong. Whereas these other systems that are based on a false paradigm, it doesn't put any premium on marriage. That's not seen as the individual is more important than the marriage. If a marriage compromises the individual, then it's seen as something bad that should be done away with, because the individual is more important than the family, right? In that false paradigm. Okay. Recite one salawat, please. So that's with respect to, I kind of, in the beginning I talked about how there are kind of three stages. There's one stage where attraction first happens, you first fall in love. There's a second stage where you can choose to either act on it or not, and there's a third stage where the love fades by itself and you end up kind of, love passes away and you end up kind of abandoning it altogether for something else. So far what we've talked about is that Islam puts restrictions on the context in which you can have that first attraction, right? Until marriage comes about, and then marriage, at the time of marriage, then those restrictions are lifted. What we also have is that we know that in a circumstance where there is love already, we've already fallen in love, or we've already found this attraction. It might have been in an innocent way, meaning maybe it was a work-related relationship, or a school-related relationship where you were in close context and contact, and you ended up interacting with each other in such a way that you ended up feeling some sort of attraction to the other person. Islam also allows for this new paradigm that Islam is putting forward. It allows for the idea that we can sideline love, because love is not something that's automatic, that I just fall into and I can't control. And it's not an ultimate goal that I have to pursue no matter what. It says, no, that's not the case. There are other things that are more important than love. And so even in a context where love has already taken place and those safeguards didn't work to prevent me from falling in love, there's still hope for me to pull myself out of that. I still have a free will, and I still have a way to prevent myself from going any further, pursuing that love, if all the practical matters that I should be taking into account, if those practical matters say that this isn't a healthy relationship. Right? Because and all it's possible because my new paradigm, my Islamic paradigm, says that love is not the ultimate goal. It's not the thing you should pursue, even if obstacles are in your way. Whereas it says, no, if those things that I mentioned, if, for instance, you're not on the same page religiously, you fall in love with a person, but religiously you're not on the same page, that's a red light. You should stop right there. Don't pursue that relationship anymore. Don't promote it anymore. Don't encourage the other person anymore, because this relationship is a dead end. It might be, you might think you're in happiness for a little while as long as that love is there, but very, very quickly you're gonna butt heads over this extremely important issue of faith. Right? Or other practical issues, work-related issues, family values and expectations in life, and I don't know, career choices, and all these different things that are so important in making that marriage work. If any or all of those things are not working out in this relationship, then those are all red lights that say shut this down right away. Even though you fall in love and you have some sort of attraction, that's not the right relationship. Put that aside and pursue somebody else where those practical things are there. Right? So suddenly it's a very practical way of looking at love, which actually pans out. It doesn't sound very romantic necessarily, but again, that's not the goal. The goal is happiness. Right? And happiness is not in that romantic view of love. It's in this very practical view of love. Ask any of your parents or grandparents who have had successful marriages, and you'll see that these are the things that really matter. Right? One other thing that so the third part of that equation, one was falling in love, one was this middle part, and then the end of love, when love doesn't happen. If you have this this Islamic paradigm, love is fully in my control. Right? If a time comes, right, and they do kind of these psychological analyses of how relationships work and stuff like that. And they say like every certain number of years, 4 years or whatever it is, there's a kind of a waxing and a waning of the relationship. It becomes stronger, and then sometime after 4 years, there are problems and psychological. There are all sorts of ideas about how the relationship between two people evolves over time. But even practically, anecdotally, we know that's the case. So, with time, it's possible for conflicts to arise. It's possible for just different things to happen where for instance, the husband and the wife end up feeling like they're not in love anymore. But with this paradigm, it's no longer simply something that happens to me. I have control over love. Love is not something I fall into. I can make love happen. Right? There are things that I can do to, for instance, change my attitude towards my spouse. Right? That's something I can change about myself. The spouse does not even have to change for this to work. I can change my attitude, change my expectations about what I want from my spouse in such a way that they feel like that it caters to who they actually are. And so my expectations are no longer false expectations. I have some dream about how she should be or how he should be. But now I'm looking at who he or she is. I said, this is what I want. What are the good things in this person? and what benefit has this person brought to this relationship, and I start seeing positive in it, for instance, that's just one way of changing the way we're thinking so that we can rekindle love, right? Because love is now no longer something that I have to passively accept and it just comes over me, but I can now actively have a role in fostering it as well. Of course, sometimes the time comes for divorce as well. Because love is not everything, there are times when you might marry someone, you might be in love with the person, but there are times when things are so far gone at some of those fundamental levels, those practical levels, for instance, if those go wrong, there is time for divorce as well. There's room for divorce, right? But even there, Islam has certain guidelines about how the divorce should happen, right? There are two verses that say it very beautifully. This is in Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah says, وَإِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ فَبَلَغْنَ أَجَلَهُنَّ فَأَمْسِكُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ سَرِّحُوهُنَّ بِمَعْرُوفٍ. If it comes time to divorce, right, then divorce, and once the iddah is over, then you have two choices. You can either keep the marriage together properly in a good way, or you let each other go also in a good way, right? In both cases, bil ma'ruf, right? So with kindness, with good words, with good feelings, you separate. You realize we can't live anymore together, but we can still kind of part in a civil way where we haven't burnt bridges and we don't hate each other in a way that we can't even look at each other and these kinds of things. So even the divorce happens in a very civil and practical way. Or in Surah Al-Ahzab, he says, "Asarrihuhunna sarahan jamila." Right? Also in the same way, like when you leave her and let her go after the divorce, let it be in a way that's civil, that's beautiful, in a way where feelings are not hurt and everything's still good in terms of your relationship as people, as a believing brother and sister, if not as a husband and a wife. All right. There's one last thing I want to mention before I move on to the other segment of the speech, and that is that sometimes there's one common mistake I see amongst Muslims, even though we might know about this Islamic paradigm of how love actually works, we do have our own problem with our the common paradigm of how love is, and that is that we sometimes have this notion that there's one person kind of destined for you. Right? You've probably heard this. In different languages, they have different expressions for it. The one I remember when I was growing up, my parents would say, for instance, they would use the word qismat, like qismat me, right? It's kind of in your destiny to find a particular person, right? And there are probably similar kind of idiomatic phrases in Arabic, Farsi, and other languages to express the same idea. But there's one heavenly match, for instance. And it's just like the process of courting and searching is to find that one person that Allah has written for you, and they're hidden somewhere, and you just have to keep on searching, and finally you'll find the person and everything will work out. Right? That's also a false idea. It sounds romantic and all, but there's no basis for that kind of view of how things work. Right? First of all, Allah's taqdirat. When Allah determines things, He doesn't determine them in those specific terms. Right? So for instance, even take something else like money, rizq. Right? The sustenance that He ordains for me, it's not in specific terms where He's determining, for instance, on Laylatul Qadr that you're going to earn, this particular amount of money from this particular source. What He determines is that you're going to earn this particular amount of money, or rizq. Right? How it's going to come is up to me. So if He determines, for instance, you're going to make $60,000 this year, it's up to me to either pursue it in halal and lawful ways or to pursue it in haram ways. Right? That ordained sustenance that's going to come to me. Yes, it comes from Allah, but I choose the paths, the ways to get it. It could be in an honorable way or a dishonorable way. Right? So the choice of how I achieve the taqdeer of Allah, the determination of Allah, is my own choice. The determination itself is His choice. Right? So the same thing happens with marriage. He determines that, for instance, you're going to be married. You're going to be successful in finding marriage, or He's going to at least present to you good options for who you can marry. That's His job. That's where His role ends, and then He turns it over to us to actually make the choice. And I can make bad choices or good choices, right? I could base my choice of a spouse on those false paradigms or on this correct paradigm, and the consequences are going to be different in either case. Right, so we shouldn't think that somehow he's determined this, and that's, we have to find this person. The reality is that there are multiple people that anyone could get married to. Again, it doesn't sound very romantic, but that's the reality of it. The physical attraction and those kinds of things, like we said, that happens automatically. It doesn't take it's not only that you're only physically attracted to one particular person and not to anyone else. That's not the way we're made. Mutually, both from both sides. That attraction happens whenever the chemistry happens. And that can happen to multiple people, between you and multiple people, and between multiple people and you. Right? That's where all those safeguards come into play, where we stop those other things from happening until we're finally ready for it, and then in the context of marriage, then we remove all the safeguards, and then the attraction can happen within the confines of that marital relationship. Right? So I just wanted to address that. We had a false paradigm that we're surrounded with from the outside, but we also have some false paradigms within our own way of thinking that we should be aware of. And be critical of these things. Be attuned to them. Next time you see them, call them out for yourself. Discuss it with the people you're watching with, your kids and your family members, right? And be aware of this, and just at very least, immune yourself in that way, that you're not buying into it and saying, "Oh, that's so beautiful. That's such a great love story." Realize that it's a terrible love story because it's based on something that's totally false, right? Okay, recite one salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. All right, so I want to take about 10 minutes to address questions that you might have. And the point here is, like I mentioned yesterday, I want you to, the question should be specific to what I've talked about. And the idea is I want you to, if there are any points of confusion, then let's clarify them right now before you leave, so that you don't go home with any misunderstandings. There is the ability to email questions or put them in the box as well. I have some questions from yesterday, but I realized that these questions that were written to me are not necessarily specific to the lecture. So we'll have to figure out some other way to answer the questions. But again, right now, if you have questions on either side specific to the lecture, then entertain those. Let's just, if you can make the questions brief, and I'll also make the answers brief, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. You brought up one rule about perfumes, which is I've been thinking about this, trying to figure out why the woman cannot use the perfume to mask their natural smell, which in reality is scientifically known that natural smell really is an attraction for the male. And it is known for the animal and also for human. Why this rule about not using that?
I don't know any further than the rule itself. I know about pheromones in the natural world, but I'm not sure how powerful they are for our relationships. I know a lot of perfumes at least Western perfumes, are designed to mimic pheromones. And that's one of the problems. If these kinds of perfumes, definitely they're not allowed because they're designed to attract the opposite sex. Can we see on the sisters as well? On the sisters' side, there's some on this side. Let's go back and forth to make it fair.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
I don't know if this. You said in your lecture that there isn't one potential option for us as people to get married. In the Quran, though, it says in Surah Baqarah that we find the person that we find peace within them. Like when you get married, like those are the people that, I don't know. Yes, you find relief in that person that you marry. So does that mean there isn't just one person? There's potential people, or is that? Because I always wondered, is that just for marriage, or is that for outside of marriage?
Yeah. So the verse I'm thinking of is in Surah Ar-Rum. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ جَعَلَ لَكُم مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. So he's saying that. He's not saying that there's somebody out there who's going to provide that peace and that tranquility for you. He's saying in the context of marriage, the blessing that Allah has given us is that He's created a system in which we can have these kinds of bonds of marriage, and through that we can find tranquility. It's talking about the institution of marriage, but that's not specific to one particular person. Right? There could be multiple people. It's our job to confine it to one person, or in a polygamous situation to multiple, but within the confines of Islamic law. Not a free-for-all.
Assalamu alaikum. You mentioned about dress for women, but is there a specific dress code for men as well? Oftentimes it's not discussed or mentioned.
Yeah, it's much the restrictions are actually much less than what we already dress, right? So like the restrictions for men are basically shorts would be enough, even less than shorts. If they're loose fitting, that would be enough in the presence of women. So legally that's allowed, but culturally that's not acceptable. Especially in Muslim society, that much uncovering would not be acceptable. The burden on that side is actually placed on the women. They're not allowed to look. Like men are, like for instance, we can wear short sleeve shirts, right? But women are not allowed to look at our arms, right? At least if there's any sort of lustful thoughts and these sorts of things. So the burden is on them not to look, not on us to cover. Whereas for women, it's the opposite. They have to cover, and also we have to look. So we have to not look. They have to cover, we have to not look. The not's there. Any other sisters? No, I don't think so.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Alaikum.
You mentioned there are paradigms that exist. Practical things that can exist in order to foster love, but in different parts of the world, like you see, there are different like situations where, for example, in the States, men and women are they go to high school, they go to college, and so that so-called love doesn't foster until after a certain age. Whereas in the Middle East, that's not like a requirement for people to go to school, or for both genders to go to school to a certain age. And so, is there one kind of practical thing that you could give an example of that that applies in like worldwide that people can use before they foster love?
Clarify the question. You're saying in here we have a certain.
Here, for example, like men and women have to go through to college before they ever have a chance at
getting married.
getting married and then fostering love. Whereas in the Middle East, like not all women have to go to college.
Oh.
So
Okay.
what's something practical that can apply like everywhere?
That's part of the idea. We should rethink that as well as Muslims, right? That part of our own paradigm. That's not anyone else's problem. This is our own problem. The way we have now conceived of marriage as something that happens after the husband is, after the groom is well settled in life, that is an unreasonable expectation, right? Because sometimes it's your late 20s at best before you're settled in life and you can afford a house and you can afford kind of all these expectations that our society, Muslim society, has placed on the boy, right? And that's unreasonable. We need to get married early. 20 is late. I was trying to get married when I was 19, 18, 20. I wasn't able to find anyone until I was a little older, like 25 or 26. But I wanted to get married early, and my parents were also supportive of that, right? That's more practical. That's especially here. There are going to be problems with that kind of conception of marriage, right? We'll need family support financially as well. But to have a marriage that happens much earlier in this sort of a society where we're constantly exposed to the opposite gender, whether we like it or not, right? It's such a, they call it like a sexed up society. It's really important for us to make sure that we get married early, right? So we don't have to worry about all the temptations out there. So I didn't answer your question, but your question kind of sparked another issue that I think our paradigm within our own culture for how marriage is delayed so much, that's a very harmful paradigm. We need to rethink that and encourage your kids to get married earlier, help them to get married. Usually the problem is not the kids. At least in my experience, it's usually the parents who are the problem, where the kids are ready to get married early, but the parents are not supportive. The girl's family says, I need this particular mahr, which is a ridiculous mahr that even established men maybe cannot afford, right? And certainly a young man is not going to be able to afford. Or she has to finish her studies, or he has to finish this or that and have this degree and that degree. And we put all these requirements until they're 30 years old before they can even get married because the parents are saying so. Whereas if it was left to them, they would get married when they were 20 and even younger.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Yeah, I was just curious, is love of also different kinds, according to Quran? So that's my first question. And my second question is if you could enlighten us the difference between muhabbat and mawaddat.
Yeah, let's leave the second question aside because it's not really related. The first question, I focused very much on the. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so he asked, are there different kinds of love? He was asking specifically from the Quran or Hadith. Are there different kinds of love? And then he asked, is there a difference between mahabba and mawadda, these two kinds of things that we loosely translate, both as love. So the first question, yes, there are different aspects of love, different kinds of love you can think of. So I focus very heavily on attraction, physical attraction, and then also emotional attachment, because those are the ones that were relevant to this particular paradigm. But certainly we can, like the kind of love we have for Allah, for instance, the love we have for the Ahlul Bayt, or for someone who's noble, or for our parents, that's a different kind of love than either of these two things. So certainly there are other kinds of loves, but those don't deal with this particular paradigm, so I focus mainly on this kind of love. Mawadda and mahabba, let's leave, that's a different topic. Any other questions from the sister side?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. You mentioned in your speech about Allah sets things for us in place, and we have to make the choices, whether it's up to us to make the right choice or the bad choice.
Right.
Besides a woman being Muslim, Shia, educated, what are other key points that a man could look for in a woman as Islamic way of how she carries herself for me to make that decision?
Yeah, so he's asking what other considerations are there for choosing a spouse. So Islamically, actually, we have fewer restrictions or fewer guidelines. Islamically, the legal guideline that we have is that the man and wife be kuf for each other. And how that's defined legally is that they both follow the same religion. They both be Shi'i. Right? So a Shi'i man is the kuf or a Shi'i woman. And vice versa. But we know practically, this is a place where our practical considerations also have to inform our view of this. Right? Because that's not enough. That's a very important, that should be the first consideration, but it's not the only consideration. Right? So some of the things I mentioned, I think those are also extremely important. And these are things that I think the best source of this other information is the advice of elders and people who have been through successful marriages or seen successful marriages. They can oftentimes inform this a lot, in a better way than somebody who's trying to get married and who doesn't have any experience. I tend to, a lot of times the ulama tend to see unhealthy marriages quite a bit because of counseling issues or because of divorces and these kinds of things. So we see a lot of the problems of what hasn't worked. And a lot of issues are these things that I mentioned. Your expectations in life, right? You have to be on the same page in terms of what life is going to be like for that marriage to work. Career choices and whether or not the wife wants to work or can work and those kinds of things, those are also important things because that could be part of her identity and how she sees her future. And if the husband doesn't want that to happen, then that's going to be a roadblock. Family, right? In many contexts, in-laws are an important part of the family, and they have to be on board as well. They also have to be people you're not just marrying your wife, or you're not just marrying your husband, you're marrying your in-laws as well. Right? They're also going to be a part of your family, so you want to make sure that dynamic is also healthy and good. So these are practical things that we won't find them in a hadith necessarily, right? But they're valid, good considerations. There are certain considerations that we sometimes do prioritize that are mentioned in a hadith as useless considerations, right? So for instance, money, wealth is not a consideration that we should have, right? For instance, even looks. So on one hand, looks are acknowledged that physical attraction has to be there. That's just the way we work. But at the same time, we're encouraged not to make that the determining factor in our choice. There's one hadith I was looking at today. It said that if a man marries a woman because of her beauty, he'll never get what he wants. And I think what it means is that beauty it's short-lived, right? So even if she's beautiful today, none of us stays beautiful for very long, right? And so very quickly that's going to fade. And if that was the whole reason why you married her, then what else is left for you? So you have to have some greater reason for marrying that person than just something that's going to fade, which money and and looks and these kinds of things are those kinds of things. I might be well off today, but who knows? I might lose everything tomorrow, right? That can't be the basis of your attraction to or your willingness to marry me. There must be something that's more kind of fundamental to who I am that's going to make this marriage work. Okay, recite with salawat, please. Allah. وصل على محمد وآل محمد. So in the end, I want to share with you a story from Karbala. And I think we've been through this before. Last time I came as well. One of the challenges that we have with these commemorations is this is the time when a storyteller who knows how to tell the story should come. And I like the way Iranis, for instance, do their majalis. In Qom, our teachers would give their speech. And then just at the right time, as they're ready to transition, the Roza Khan would come and he would beautifully transition and tell the story and make the emotional kind of thing happen. Unfortunately, we don't have that function here. Or maybe we do. Amongst you, if there's somebody who can do that, that's great. But in the absence of that, what I like to do, I feel very strongly that the story needs to be told accurately. It can't be, I can't embellish it. In good conscience, I can't embellish the story with things that didn't happen. And we have so much information about Karbala. What I've done is I've taken excerpts from historical works and translated them and tried to put them into a story form. But I feel most comfortable reading it to you in the best way I can, rather than trying to tell you the story in an embellished way, perhaps adding false things or things that didn't actually happen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So this is the story of a person by the name of Amr ibn Junada. Junada, his father, was an Ansar. He was one of the companions of the Prophet. So Junada ibn Ka'ab ibn al-Harith al-Ansari was among those who accompanied Imam al-Hussein from Mecca to Karbala. Right, so the father was one of the companions. And this is also probably the first sad thing that happened to Imam Hussein, is the abandonment of so many people at that point when he finally found out news from Kufa that Muslim and Hanit had been killed. Because until that, it seemed like everything was leading to success. From Medina to Mecca, and from Mecca, as he moved towards Kufa, people were joining him. Everywhere he stopped, he'd let people know what he was going for, what was happening, and people were joining him by the throngs. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of people who had joined him, but at one point, as they got closer to Kufa, one of the things that happened was that so many people left. And he was only left with maybe a couple of hundred people, and even that dwindled to the 72 that we know of. So this person, Junada ibn Ka'ab, had accompanied the Imam to Karbala. Like Imam al-Hussein, he brought his family with him, his wife and his son. Junada participated in the first attack on the Kufans. As he fought, he chanted the following lines of Raja's poetry. He said, I am Junada and the son of Al-Harith. I am neither a coward nor one to renege on my promise. On my pledge until my heir inherits over my dead body, which shall remain in the dust. He succeeded in killing 16 Kufans before he in turn was killed. After he was martyred, his 11-year-old son Amr came to Imam al-Hussein seeking permission to fight. The Imam denied him permission. When he persisted, the Imam said, your father has already been killed. I fear that your mother, who is also here at the battle, that your mother will be displeased to lose you if you are killed. Who will protect your mother if in this desert if you are killed? This is one of the ways that the Imam would test his companions. We see that on the night of Ashura as well, where he does everything he can to release them of any sort of moral obligation that they had. He wanted to make sure that these people are truly belong here, they want to be here, they know exactly what they're getting into. So even this child, he offers him every excuse that he can to excuse him from having to do anything. You've already given a sacrifice. Your family is already honorable. Your father has already sacrificed himself. Nothing's expected of you. Your job is done as a family. You have your mother to take care of. If you die, what's your mother going to do? Right? He offers him every excuse that he can. The boy's response, Amr replied, my mother is the one who ordered me to come and ask you. With that, permission was granted, and he proceeded to fight in the battle. He fought like a hero. All the while his mother cheered him on, saying, glad tidings, my son, you shall be given drink by the guardian of the pool of Kawthar. Amr recited the following rajas as he fought. Hussein is my commander, and what a commander he is. He brings happiness to the heart of the bearer of tidings and the warner, Muhammad. Ali and Fatima are his parents, thus do you know anyone like him? When he was finally killed, his murderer beheaded him and threw his head toward Imam al-Hussein's camp. Amr's mother took his head and wiped the blood from his face and said, very good, my boy, you are the light of my eyes. Then she threw the head back into the battlefield. Then she grabbed a tent pole and attacked the Kufans, chanting the following rajas herself. I am an old woman and weak, decrepit, worn out and thin, but I shall strike you with much force to defend the children of Fatima the noble. She killed 2 men before Imam Hussein brought her back to his camp and prayed for her well-being. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, accept our devotion during these 10 nights. Help us to commemorate the events of Karbala in a way that's pleasing to our Imam. Reward us and forgive us for our sins because of the tears that we're able to shed during these nights. Help us to follow in the footsteps of our Imam and his companions and his family. Let us live our lives and die, inshallah, the way they lived theirs and they died. Allow us to be amongst the army of our Imam, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, as he avenges the death of his grandfather, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.